From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
This is the single worst humanitarian crisis in the world. And unfortunately, in this case, unlike in Rwanda in the past or in Bosnia, the United States has had a role because we initially provided aid to the Saudis and we continue to refuel their planes.
As the U.S.-backed Saudi-led coalition begins a major offensive on a key port city in Yemen, we speak to Democratic Congressman Ro Khanna of California, a leading critic of the war in Yemen, which has already killed 15,000 civilians, sparked the world's worst cholera epidemic, and pushed the country to the brink of famine. Then to the Poor People's Campaign.
Imagine working at a job that doesn't pay you a living wage day in and day out. Imagine not even having a basic income and not knowing how you're going to feed your children. We have to have a people in this country that are willing to stand as long as it takes and organize as long as it takes and fight as long as it takes.
50 years after the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., the Reverend William Barber is helping to lead a new Poor People's Campaign. We'll air a report from Washington, where Barber and 100 others were arrested on Monday. Some religious leaders were handcuffed for 5 hours, had their religious vestments ripped off of them, and were brought into court in ankle irons after being jailed overnight. Among them, Poor People's Campaign leader, Reverend Liz Theoharis. Plus, we look at the Supreme Court's major ruling upholding Ohio's controversial voter purge law. The religious leaders were arrested outside the Supreme Court. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. A federal judge has approved AT&T's $85 billion merger with Time Warner after ruling the Justice Department failed to prove the merger violates antitrust laws. The far-reaching deal is expected to reshape the media industry and will give AT&T control over Warner Brothers film and television studios, along with CNN, TNT, HBO, and many other brands. Only 3 days after President Trump's inauguration, AT&T paid $600,000 to President Trump's personal lawyer and fixer Michael Cohen's company for help advising the telecom giant on how to steer the planned merger through regulatory scrutiny. Despite the money, the Justice Department sued to block the merger. Tuesday's approval of the AT&T Time Warner deal is expected to spur a flurry of other mergers and corporate consolidation across industries. In Yemen, the U.S.-backed Saudi-led coalition has launched an offensive against the key port city of Hodeidah. The offensive is expected to be the biggest battle in the coalition's ongoing 3-year assault against Yemen's Houthi rebels. The conflict has already killed 15,000 civilians, sparked the world's worst cholera epidemic, and pushed Yemen to the brink of famine. Humanitarian groups have warned the offensive could be a catastrophe for 250,000 civilians living in Hodeidah and for the rest of Yemen, which is highly dependent on aid that travels through the port. This is Jens Larke with the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs.
Military attack or siege on Hodeidah will impact hundreds of thousands of innocent civilians. In a prolonged worst case, we fear that as many as 250,000 people may lose everything, even their lives.
We'll have more on the offensive against Yemen's key port city, Hodeidah, after headlines. We'll be speaking with Silicon Valley Congressmember Ro Khanna. In Afghanistan, at least 18 people were killed in Taliban attacks, including the governor of the northern Kohistan district Tuesday. The attacks came as the government's 8-day ceasefire was slated to take effect. The Taliban has announced its own ceasefire during the first 3 days of Eid later this week. In Israel, police again questioned Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu in connection with one of a series of corruption cases. Protesters gathered outside Netanyahu's house on Monday night demanding his resignation as police questioned the prime minister inside his home about the bribery scandal involving communications giant Bezeq Group, aimed at securing more favorable media coverage for Netanyahu and his family. A number of members of Netanyahu's inner circle have already been arrested in this corruption case. race. Back in the United States, voters went to the polls Tuesday for primaries in Virginia, South Carolina, Maine, Nevada, and North Dakota. In Maine, voters used a new type of voting system, ranked choice voting, which allows voters to rank their preferred candidates in order of preference. On Tuesday, Maine residents voted to also use this system for upcoming federal elections. But Maine's Republican Governor Paul LePage is now threatening not to certify the results of Tuesday's primary because of the ranked choice voting.
Voting, most horrific thing in the world. I will probably not certify the election. I will leave it up to the courts to decide.
Meanwhile, in South Carolina, Republican Congressmember Mark Sanford lost his primary election to State Representative Katie Arrington after he repeatedly criticized President Trump. In an unusual Election Day move, Trump attacked Sanford Tuesday by Twitter, tweeting, "Mark Sanford has been very unhelpful to me in my campaign to MAGA. He is MIA and nothing but trouble. He's better off in Argentina," the last part of a reference to the 2009 scandal in which then-Governor Sanford disappeared for a few days, first saying he was hiking the Appalachian Trail and later revealing he was having an extramarital affair in Argentina. After conceding defeat Tuesday night, Sanford said he did not regret criticizing President Trump.
It may have cost me an election in this case, but I stand by every one of those decisions to disagree with the president because I didn't think it, at the end of the day, was either concurrent with the promises I made when I first ran for office or the voices of the very people the first district that I represent.
In Virginia, former state Trump campaign co-chair Corey Stewart won the Republican Senate primary and will challenge Democratic Senator Tim Kaine in November. Stewart ran on a pro-Trump, far-right, anti-immigrant platform. He's also embraced the Confederate flag and refused to condemn white supremacists for their deadly rally in Charlottesville, Virginia. Women candidates also won big Tuesday night, including in Virginia, where State Senator Jennifer Wexton won her House Democratic primary. She'll challenge Republican Congresswoman Barbara Comstock in November. In Nevada, Susie Lee won her House primary race. The New York Times reports on the Democratic side, Tuesday's primary results were a victory for the Democratic establishment, with a number of candidates handpicked by party leaders beating out insurgent left challengers. On the Republican side, the results represented a victory for far right wing of the party, with Trump-aligned candidates beating out their challengers. In immigration news, McClatchy's reporting the Trump administration is considering building tent cities on Texas military bases to detain immigrant children being held in U.S. custody. There are now more than 10,000 immigrant children being held in U.S. custody as the Trump administration continues its policy of separating children from their immigrant parents at the border as the families pursue asylum claims. And in Orlando, Florida, hundreds gathered outside the Pulse nightclub Tuesday to honor the 49 people who were killed 2 years ago in one of the deadliest attacks ever on the LGBT community in the United States. The majority of those killed were young LGBT people of color. Meanwhile, also in Florida, students and activists organized a die-in near Trump's Mar-a-Lago resort to demand the administration take action to curb gun violence. Among those protesting and participating in vigils Tuesday were the survivors of the Valentine's Day massacre at Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School that killed 17 people in Parkland, Florida, earlier this year. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. We begin today's show in Yemen, where a coalition led by Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates has launched an all-out offensive against the key port city of Hodeidah. The offensive is expected to be the biggest battle in the ongoing 3-year war between the U.S.-backed Saudi-led coalition and Houthi rebels. The war has already killed 15,000 civilians, sparked the world's worst cholera epidemic, and pushed the country to the brink of famine. Humanitarian groups have warned the offensive could be a catastrophe for 250,000 civilians living in Hodeidah and for the rest of Yemen, which is highly dependent on aid that travels through the port. The World Health Organization estimates 8.4 million people in Yemen already face pre-famine conditions. The offensive comes just days after the U.S.-backed Saudi-led coalition bombed a new Doctors Without Borders cholera clinic in Yemen's northwest Abs region. On Tuesday, I spoke with Democratic Congressmember Ro Khanna. He represents Silicon Valley in California. He recently co-authored a bipartisan letter calling for Defense Secretary James Mattis to help prevent an attack on Hodeidah. I asked Congressman Khanna to lay out his concerns.
It would just be a catastrophe of civilian casualties. An attack on Hodeidah would mean thousands and thousands of women and children and civilians would die. Second, the port of Hodeidah is the only place right now, for practical purposes, that food and medicine can get into Yemeni civilians. So this is, one would think it just should be common sense that the United States and the international community would be doing everything in our power to keep that port open. In the past, even Ambassador Nikki Haley has talked about the importance of that port for civilians. And it would be really a dereliction of our own values to not do everything in our power to stop that attack and do everything in our power to stop refueling the Saudis from their bombing campaign in Yemen.
What do you know about this Doctors Without Borders cholera clinic that the Saudi regime just bombed? They said they gave their coordinates to the Saudis. We have heard this so many times before in other places, for example, in Afghanistan.
Well, it's really shocking and unconscionable, and this is not the only incident. We've had reports over the last year and a half about the Saudis indiscriminately bombing civilian sites, bombing relief workers, and that's not something that the United States should in any way participate in. Our refueling of the Saudi planes is something the Saudis desperately rely on. We started doing that as a sop to Saudi Arabia when we did the Iran deal. We thought, OK, we're going to do this Iran deal, and the Saudis are insistent on this, so let's provide some assistance. It was a mistake. I don't think anyone would have anticipated the level of humanitarian catastrophe in Yemen. It's important to understand that this is not a counterterrorism operation in Yemen against al-Qaeda. This is an active interference in the Saudi efforts to bomb the Houthis and engage in a civil war. So the United States needs to stop our role in furthering the Saudi efforts, and we certainly need to do everything in our power to stop the Saudis from attacking the port of Hodeidah.
Congressman Khanna, the Wall Street Journal is reporting the Trump administration is weighing a request by the United Arab Emirates to expand the U.S. role in the war in Yemen by providing direct assistance to the impending offensive against the port city of Hodeidah. So you're talking about, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates. These are the countries also that particularly Jared Kushner, President Trump's son-in-law, senior advisor to President Trump, is very close to. What does this direct assistance mean? And how is this happening without congressional approval?
Well, there's been, candidly, a lack of transparency by the Trump administration. In the past, when Secretary Mattis has testified to the Armed Services Committee, on which I sit, he has been very clear that our efforts in Yemen are largely limited to counterterrorism operations against al-Qaeda, and that he has said that the United States does not have an active role in assisting the Saudis in their fight against the Houthis. But then we are hearing reports that is not true, and that they're considering expanding our aid to the Saudis, not because of counterterrorism interests, but really because of the civil war, which is a proxy war with Iran. And so that is what prompted several of us to write Secretary Mattis a letter. At the very least, we need transparency from the administration about our objectives in Yemen. They are relying on the 2001 AUMF, authorization of force, which allows us to go after al-Qaeda or its affiliates anywhere in the world. That was overly broad. But even under that authorization of force, there is no authority to go after the Houthis, and the administration just needs to be far more transparent. And we're going to demand transparent answers from Secretary Mattis and others.
About the United Arab Emirates. It's United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia. What is the U.S. interests in both of these places?
Well, we see them both as allies, candidly, to contain Iran. And this type of balance of power politics has gotten us into a lot of problems in the Middle East. And unfortunately, we're continuing the same type of thinking, saying that we need to ally with countries that may be a check on Iranian expansion. Unfortunately, the administration has continued down that path of thinking without any authority from the United States Congress. But the first step is to really understand what our involvement and role is in Yemen. The administration has been very coy about admitting that we're actually aiding the Saudis in a proxy civil war, aiding the United Arab Emirates in a proxy war in Yemen against Iran, because they know that has absolutely no authorization by Congress.
And talk more about this for people who are not familiar with the U.S. role. Why the U.S.? Is it all involved in this on the side of Saudi Arabia? Now, under Obama, for a period, they were directly assisting. Then, as you pointed out, they put some limitations on that assistance. If you could explain what that was and what caused that, and then how Trump himself is responding. Do you think he has any understanding of what's happening in Yemen? With, not even to mention the deaths, something like 15,000, but talking about just people afflicted with cholera, the worst situation in the world. Over 1 million Yemenis are suffering from cholera. The Doctors Without Borders clinic was a cholera clinic.
Well, you're right to point out the humanitarian catastrophe. This is the single worst humanitarian crisis in the world. And unfortunately, in this case, unlike in Rwanda in the past or in Bosnia, the United States has had a role because we initially provided aid to the Saudis and we continue to refuel their planes. The reason for our aid to the Saudis was as a balance to our supporting Iran with the Iran deal. We were negotiating with Iran to have the Iran deal. The Saudis complained to the Obama administration at the time, saying we feel insecure with the normalization of the relationship with Iran. And the administration made a decision that they would provide some assistance to the Saudis, partly to make sure that the Saudis still felt secure in their relationship with the United States. Now, when you talk to most of the former Obama administration officials, they will say that was a mistake, that they could never have fathomed the level of brutality of the Saudi regime in Yemen. They couldn't have fathomed the civilian casualties. They tried to wind it down. Well, then they realized that the Trump administration was coming in, but it was too late for them to wind down the efforts and the support to the Saudis. And then the Trump administration comes in and they redouble their support of the Saudis and the United Arab Emirates as a check on Iran. The Trump administration is singularly focused on containing Iran, on supporting allies of ours that may help us box Iran in. And so the administration has doubled down on aiding the Saudis in this catastrophe and with a huge civilian loss of life.
Democratic Congressmember Ro Khanna of California. To hear him weighing in on the North Korea-U.S. summit, you can go to democracynow.org. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, major Supreme Court decision on voter purging, and over 100 people are arrested in Washington, D.C. as the Poor People's Campaign continues. Stay with us.
Oh, so your wounds they show. I know you have never felt so low. But hold on, head up, be strong. Oh, hold on until you hear them come.
Angel by the Wings by Sia, here on Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. As we turn to Washington, where the Supreme Court has ruled 5-4 to uphold Ohio's aggressive purging of voters from the rolls. One survey found nearly 150,000 people were removed from the voting rolls in recent years in Ohio's 3 largest counties alone. Critics say the court's decision is yet another victory for conservatives trying to restrict voting rights. For more, we're joined by Ari Berman, senior writer at Mother Jones, reporting fellow at the Nation Institute. His latest pieces are titled, "The Supreme Court is Helping Republicans Kill a Key Voting Rights Law," and we now know why Steve Bannon and Chris Kobach lobbied for a citizenship question on the census. Welcome back to Democracy Now!, Ari. So talk about this decision.
Well, it's a really big decision because Ohio has purged 2 million voters since 2011, more than any other state. African-American voters in the state's 3 largest counties were purged at twice the rate of whites. So it appears that this purging has been discriminatory. And one of the ways that Ohio purges is they remove infrequent voters from the rolls. So if you don't vote in election, Ohio sends you a mailer. If you don't respond to that mailer to confirm your registration and you miss 2 more elections, you are purged from the rolls even if you are still eligible to vote. So what Ohio is doing is they're using a new way of purging to try to kick people off the voting rolls. And this is very disturbing, not just because Ohio is such an important swing state, but because this could open the door to more voter purging by Republican states and really, in a lot of ways, compromise people's most fundamental right.
In her dissent, Justice Sonia Sotomayor wrote, Congress enacted the National Voter Registration Act against the backdrop of substantial efforts by states to disenfranchise low-income and minority voters, including programs that purged eligible voters from registration lists because they failed to vote in prior elections. Sotomayor went on to write, the court errs in ignoring this history and distorting the statutory text, ultimately sanctioning the very purging that Congress expressly sought to protect against, she added.
And I think this was so important because this is a very technical case about how you can and can't purge. But Sotomayor brought up the bigger picture, which is we have a very, very long history in this country of voter suppression and of discriminating against people when they try to vote. And the National Voter Registration Act of 1993, which was really the second major piece of voting rights legislation after the Voting Rights Act of 1965, allowed people to register at DMVs and other public agencies and was an incredibly important law. And what Republicans are trying to do now is they're trying to weaken a key voting rights law to make it easier to purge the voting rolls. This is just one of many voter suppression tactics we're seeing, along with voter ID laws, cutting early voting, making it harder to register to vote. Voter purging is part of this, and it's a relic of the Jim Crow era. This was done in the Jim Crow South. Make it as hard as possible for black voters to be able to register, and even if they do register, then you purge them from the rolls. And what Sotomayor is saying, history is repeating itself here. We are gutting the very law that was passed to prevent this kind of thing from happening.
Talk about the role of the newest justice, Neil Gorsuch.
Well, every 5-4 decision on the Supreme Court, you have to remember, Amy, is likely a result of the fact that Mitch McConnell and Republicans in the Senate stole a Supreme Court seat from President Obama, and Donald Trump put Neil Gorsuch on the court. So this case in Ohio only happened because there was a stolen Supreme Court seat. And it's really amazing that not only are they stealing a Supreme Court seat, they're stealing a Supreme Court seat, and then they're making it harder for people to be able to vote. So this is really a two-pronged attack on democracy. First, you deny the will of the people in that President Obama should have been able to make this appointment because he was elected in 2012. And then, not only that, you deny the will of the people by then making it harder for them to vote in the first place.
So talk about the person on which this case was based.
So the case was based on a guy by the name of Larry Harmon. He was a Navy vet. What happened is he voted in 2008, and then he didn't vote for a few elections, and then he showed up in 2015 to vote on a local referendum, and he found that he was no longer on the voter rolls. And usually, you're only removed from the voter rolls if you're ineligible to vote, meaning you've died, or you've moved, or you've committed a crime, or done something else to try to change your status. He hadn't done anything. He still lived at the same place. He had voted in the past, but he was removed from the voter rolls. And the thing about voter purging that really is so problematic is that people don't know that they're purged from the rolls until they show up at the polls. Then they're not able to vote, and there's nothing they can do about it. And so that's what happened in Ohio. That's what happened to thousands of people in Ohio. And the worry is that more Republican states are going to try to do this thing in the future.
Very quickly, if you can talk about the piece you wrote about Chris Kobach.
Well, we now know that Steve Bannon, then the White House chief advisor, and Chris Kobach, the Kansas Secretary of State, former chair of Donald Trump's Election Integrity Commission, pushed for a question on the census, a citizenship question on the census for the first time since 1950. And this question is going to drastically diminish responses from immigrants. It's going to threaten the entire accuracy of the census, which is so critical for democracy. And the reason they wanted this question on the census, new document shows, was to exclude non-citizens from counting towards political representation. That would be a dramatic rewrite of the Constitution, of democratic norms. And what it would do is it would deny immigrant communities, places like New York and California, significant representation, and it would shift representation to wider and more Republican areas. And so what Chris Kobach and Steve Bannon are doing is they're trying to weaponize the census to fit the Trump administration's aims, to try to help Republicans politically, try to hurt immigrant communities in more diverse states.
Ari, you tweeted yesterday, 55 years ago today, NAACP Field Secretary Medgar Evers was assassinated by KKK in Mississippi, a reminder of the bloodshed fighting for voting rights.
My worry is that history is repeating itself here, that so many people like Medgar Evers paid the highest price, their lives, fighting for the right to vote. And 50 years later, we have a Supreme Court, we have a Republican Party that is undermining that most fundamental right, that is finding new ways to try to disenfranchise people, whether it's voter ID laws or voter purging or cutting back on the amount of time that people have to vote. This is, as Justice Breyer once said, old poison in new bottles. We've seen this before. We've seen the disenfranchisement of Americans before. People like Medgar Evers died for it. And for us to be going backwards in such a dramatic way, for the Supreme Court to be undermining such a core right, to me, is just extremely disturbing and something that we really have to pay a lot of attention to.
Finally, your biggest concerns for the midterm elections that are coming up this year?
Well, my biggest concern is that so many Republican-controlled states have new voting restrictions in effect now. 23 states have passed new voting restrictions in effect for the first time since 2010. Not only that, we have gerrymandered maps all across the country. The Supreme Court may strike that down, or they may uphold it, which means that all the gerrymandering will continue in 2018 and 2020. So I think we like to believe that we have totally free and fair elections in this country. But there are a lot of ways in which people's right to vote are being undermined. And so when we look at who's going to win the election, we also have to look at the conditions under which the elections are going to take place in the first place.
Ari Berman, senior writer at Mother Jones, reporting fellow at the Nation Institute. We'll link to your pieces. Your book, Give Us the Ballot, The Modern Struggle for Voting Rights in America. The pieces, the Supreme Court's helping Republicans kill a key voting rights law. And we now know why Steve Bannon and Chris Kobach lobbied for a citizenship question on the census. When we come back, 100 people are arrested in Washington, D.C., between the Capitol and the Supreme Court. 9 religious leaders on the steps of the Supreme Court. They were put in leg irons, their vestments ripped off them. They were held overnight in jail. You'll hear what took place on Monday in Washington. Stay with us.
Everybody's got a right to live. Everybody's got a right to live. And before this campaign fails, we'll all go down in jail. Everybody's got a right to live. I'm waiting for Washington, feeling mighty sad. Thinking about the income that I never had. Everybody's got a right to live.
Everybody's got a right to live. Jimmy Collier and Frederick Douglass Kirkpatrick here on Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. On Monday in Washington, D.C., 9 religious leaders were arrested on the steps of the Supreme Court. They were handcuffed for 5 hours, had their religious vestments ripped off them, then jailed overnight in cells with cockroaches. They were then brought into court in ankle irons. The religious leaders were among 100 people arrested in Washington, D.C. as part of a national day of action for the new Poor People's Campaign, protesting poverty and racism. Over the past 5 weeks, nearly 2,000 people have been arrested in what organizers describe as the most expansive wave of nonviolent direct action this century. The Reverends William Barber and Liz Theo-Harris are leading the protests 50 years after Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. launched the first Poor People's Campaign. Monday's protests came just hours after the Supreme Court dealt a major setback to voting rights by upholding Ohio's controversial voter purge law. Democracy Now! Is on the streets of Washington, D.C., covering the action.
Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival.
Historians are telling us that 5 weeks in, we already have the largest wave of nonviolent civil disobedience in the 21st century. Already. And we're just starting. This is just the launch. This is just the beginning.
That's right. That's right.
And we have today with us here others that will be joining us in Zone 10 when we start to rally, and across the country. We have all kinds of folks. We have workers that have been locked out of where they're supposed to work because they're standing up for higher wages.
Right. That's right.
We have homeless folks whose encampments have been destroyed, but who are coming to stand up for justice.
Yep.
We have people who have died that we're standing up for still today because they could never access affordable housing. When this country could build prefab housing in 45 minutes.
That's right.
People are dying without housing.
That's right.
There are 62 million people that make less than the living wage. But there are 400 people that make $97,000 an hour.
That's right.
That is insane. That is immoral. That is unjust.
That's right.
But we're here.
Yeah. That's right.
Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival.
My name is Ashley Little. I'm from Richmond, Virginia, and why I'm here because I'm part of the Poor People's Campaign with also Fight for 15. It's kind of opened my eyes because I was making $7.35 at McDonald's, and I was working full-time hours. So when I got who Fight for 15, it's like, oh yeah, I want 15, I want Medicaid, I want this, I want that, and it got me fired up, where it's like I want to keep going. So I've been, now as I switch jobs to Wendy's, it's like I'm still going to fight because I'm still not making what I want to make. And there's people that's making $10 and still, oh, I'm making good money. No, you're still poor, like you're still struggling.
Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival.
Okay, my name's Catrice Johnson. I'm a D.C. resident. I currently work at Ronald Reagan Airport. Many of these people that I've worked alongside, they have families, and if you don't ask them their story, you'll never know. A lot of them are suffering from like depression, and you know it's hard because you're living paycheck to paycheck, and you're trying to put food and things on the table for yourself as well as your children, and it gets hard. And many of them have like 2, maybe 3 jobs that they're working, and I see the tiredness that be on their face.
Campaña por la gente pobre.
My name is Isa Tijalo. I came here because of we need the union. I work in the airport, Dallas Airport. The company name is Huntley Corporation. We push in wheelchairs to help the old people. I get fired in my job. I work there almost 14 years, from 2004. They see that we are participating with the union because they don't like the union. And we like the union because of disadvantage, disrespect. You know, they feel like we are Africans. So they don't respect we, they don't have no regard for we. You see, so they treat you anywhere they want to do. So that one is not good. We are all the same. You see, we are all human beings. You see, so that's why I'm crying because of advantage, disrespect. You know, it's not good for me. You see.
Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival.
Yeah.
Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival.
My name's
is Valerie Blakely. I'm from Detroit, Michigan, and I came because I believe the Poor People's Campaign is going to bring about great change. 40% of Detroiters live below the poverty line, and when wages and money isn't, that you don't have access to that, but the price of water and your basic needs like electricity and things are going up, and you can't make your ends meet. I live in a neighborhood that was shut off all at one time, 3-block radius. We all got shut off. That's endemic poverty where people, and that happened all over the city. They would send 2 guys in a truck and shut off water for whole neighborhoods.
Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival.
Jaime Contreras, I'm the Vice President for SEIU 32BJ. It's sad that in this country you have 400 people making $97,000 an hour when you have, people who clean airports, the wheelchair attendants and sky cabs and, working for tip wages and unreliable tips, working 2 and 3 jobs at the airports. We're hoping that this is going to bring to light the huge income inequality in this country. But not just that, but also structural racism and systematic racism, the war economy, wage equality for women. That's what this campaign is all about, and that's why 32BJ is part of it.
If your voice trembles, sing it. If you're crying, sing it. Sing your song.
That's right.
My name is Yara Allen, and I am from Rocky Mount, North Carolina. I am Director of Cultural Arts with Repairers of the Breach. Music is so important because it is actually the heartbeat. It is the life's blood of the movement. And a lot of people are drawn to movements by the music. I've encountered several people who said when we were doing our Moral Mondays in North Carolina, I heard the music. And once they're there, they actually hear this message. So this particular song by Dr. Jimmy Collier, Mr. Jimmy Collier, it goes, everybody's got a right to live. Everybody's got a right to live. And before this campaign fails, we'll all go down to jail. Everybody's got a right to live.
Reverend Graylin Hagler, pastor of Plymouth Congregational United Church of Christ.
And what are you doing today?
Well, I've been here continuously supporting the Poor People's Campaign, a national call to moral revival, to lift up the various issues, because it's clear that we got to change the narrative of this country, change the discussion in this country that really deals with the issues that so many of us are concerned about and feel that it's at a crisis proportion, such as what's going on in terms of voter suppression, what's going on all around the country in terms of economic issues, the kind of xenophobia that seems to almost be accepted quality in political language. We're here to challenge that. We're here to continue to challenge that kind of rhetoric and that kind of dialogue and create one that is open and one that's inclusive.
The Poor People's Campaign is not a new name. That goes back 50 years to Dr. King. Can you talk about that and your activism then?
Right. I mean, it's important to remember, because I see people in the media saying, oh, the new Poor People's Campaign. Well, this is a continuation of who we are, where we've been, the kinds of things that really historically on the table, because we're dealing with Martin King 50 years ago, who, when he was assassinated, there was unfinished business. It rained and rained like it's been raining here, and basically washed away Resurrection City. But we're here today to say that this is a continued issue that we need to continue to press 50 years later until it becomes clear that that this country needs a new set of values.
Everybody's got a right to love, and before this campaign fails, we'll all go down to jail.
My name is Amy Jo, and I'm from West Virginia. Yeah. West Virginia, we have one of the nation's highest poverty rates. My children, I have 2 daughters in West Virginia. My daughters have a greater chance of dying of a drug overdose than they do from graduating from high school. Shame. It is a shame. Hi, Latonya. So my mom was widowed in the 70s, and if there was one song in my childhood that kept playing all the time, it was Get an Education, Amy Jo. Get an education because you shouldn't have to work this hard. I want everyone here to think for a minute about the poor West Virginia students who were at these colleges who have seen a tuition increase over the past 15 years from 120 to 140% for in-state tuition. I want you to take just a minute and think about the West Virginia students who have to visit the food pantries on campus, and that there is a reason for there to be food pantries on college campuses in West Virginia.
Good afternoon, brothers, sisters, comrades. My name is Josh Armstead. I'm the Vice President of Unite Here Local 23 for the DMV. I'm also, more importantly, a shop steward for Georgetown University, a strong union shop. I've lived here in D.C. all my life. It is expensive to be poor in the nation's capital.
That's right. Teach us, brother.
It is something that you cannot live with, and I'm glad I got into a union because now I'm able to actually see the benefits of standing together and actually being able to inspire others to stand together.
I'm here today in front of the Capitol with the Poor People's Campaign and my union and other unions to show solidarity to the working class people here in America, and also to tell the millionaires and the billionaires in this country that organized labor is not dead. We are growing.
Are you getting arrested today?
Absolutely.
Why?
Because it is time to take a stand and to send a message that we are willing to risk our lives, not only inside our shops, inside our workplaces, but also on the streets.
You talked about right to work. What did you say?
I talked about right to work because it is a racist stratagem to divide working class people in this country. It was made by millionaires and billionaires who wanted to divide black and white workers who they wanted to keep wages down. We need to build up our collective power again, and we need to realize that racism and capitalism are intertwined in this country, and it is the reason why we have wages that are so low. It's the reason why near the White House we have homeless people sleeping at McPherson Square. We need to come together and realize the game that is being played in this country, and we need to flip the board.
Can you tell me your own personal story, how you got involved with the union?
I got involved with the union because I saw my mother growing up struggle. I didn't ever want to be that way. I didn't ever want to live that way. So when I got to Georgetown, I joined the union. And I became involved as committee. I talked to my coworkers, and we fought against the third largest food service corporation on the planet, Aramark. And we won that contract. And because of that victory, I'm able to see. I didn't get a chance to say that on the stage, but I'm able to see because we got union healthcare and a union contract.
Co-chair of the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival, the Reverend Dr. William Barber.
Say no more. Treating people like things and corporations like people. You saw the rabbi, the imam, and the Christian minister standing together in solidarity. Something's happening. And on this campaign, we also believe in something Dr. King and many others talked about, and that is a basic guaranteed income.
That's right.
If banks are too big to fail, then people are too important to fail. People should not be dying on our streets in the richest nation in the world. And we know that not paying a people a living wage and undermining union rights and cutting social safety nets for the poor in this country, the wealthiest country in the nation in terms of money, is unconscionable. It is a moral sin, and it is a violation of our Constitution's promise to establish justice. When we have these realities of 250,000 people dying, and I know today some say, well, we've stood out here an hour. But imagine living all day outside for 24 hours. Imagine having to worry about health care 24 hours a day. Imagine working at a job that doesn't pay you a living wage day in and day out. Imagine not even having a basic income and not knowing how you're going to feed your children. We have to have a people in this country that are willing to stand as long as it takes and organize as long as it takes and fight as long as it takes. When the Supreme Court handed down today a 5-4 decision that begins to take us backwards on voting rights, and they're expecting one on labor rights. And we're seeing happening in this country now what we haven't seen since 1883. when the Supreme Court overturned the Civil Rights Acts of 1875. It is unconscionable. It is a moral sin. It is a violation of the promises to establish justice.
That's right.
This weekend I heard a Trump advisor say that there was a special place in hell for those who challenge Trump on trade. Well, I don't usually talk a lot about hell, but let me tell you what the Bible actually says about hell and special places, since he brought it up. James chapter 5 says that a final word to you arrogant rich. Take some lessons in crying. You'll need buckets of tears when the crash comes upon you. Your money is corrupt. Your fine clothes stink. Your greedy luxuries are a cancer in the gut of your nation. And it's destroying you from your life from within. You thought you were piling up wealth, but what you have actually piled up is judgment. Why? Because of all the workers you have exploited. That's in the Bible, y'all. Because of all the works you have exploited and all the workers you have cheated, now your nation stands in judgment. The groans of the workers you used and abused are roaring in the ears of God, who is a master avenger. You've looted it up on earth. You've lived it up on earth, but all of you will have to show for it. And you'll end up like a corpse if you don't change. In fact, what you've done is condemn and murder perfectly good persons who stand there and take it. You want to talk about a special place? There's a special place anytime politicians get up in the morning and all they can think to do is take people's health care. Oh, there's a special place. Whenever folk get up in the morning and all they can think of is how to block living wages and take care from the poor and the least of these. And that's why if we really love this nation and the people of this nation, we must have mass, nonviolent fusion, moral, civil disobedience. We must have mass voter mobilization. And we must have mass power building among the poor. And we must not stop until things change. I come to tell you as a preacher who has studied all the comparative religions, that what we're seeing today is not just left policies and right policies and conservative policies and liberal policies. In the theological tradition, it is sin. It is a form of wickedness when the greedy take and take and take and take from the needy and the poor. Now, I didn't use the word wickedness. Nancy, help me, Rabbi. Where's my rabbi? I wasn't the one that used it. But since these people always want to bring preachers up here to bless their unjust action, and they got Bibles all over the Capitol, and they always putting their hand on the Bible when they get ready to swear themselves and all that. Well, you have messed up now because you got some folk in a movement that know what the Bible really says. This is in the Bible. Stop blaming the poor. Stop playing religion and quoting creeds. If you didn't mean what's in the Constitution, you shouldn't have written it. Loose the bands of wickedness. Stop lying and saying America doesn't have enough resources. If you can find a $2 trillion tax cut, you can find the resources for everybody to have health care and have a living wages. And so if we want this nation to be seen as good in the sight of God, as good in the sight of the divine spirit, then we've got to cry loud and spare not. We've got to be a part of breaking these bands of wickedness, injustice, and racism and systemic policies that drive poverty. We have to set the nation free. And I heard a friend of mine, he's dead, but I heard him in a book. He was gay, but he's a powerful brother. And he said something like this in the 1930s, in the middle of traumatic times, that still has relevancy today to us. Oh, let America be America again. The land that has never been yet and yet must be. The land where every person is free. The land that is mine, the poor man's, the Indians, the Negroes, me, who made America, whose sweat and blood, whose faith and pain, whose hand at the foundry, whose plow in the rain, must bring back our mighty dream again. Talk, Langston. Sure, Langston Hughes said, call me any ugly name you choose, but the steel of freedom does not stain. From those who live like leeches on the people's lives, we must take back our land again. America. Oh yes, I say it plain. America never was America to me, and yet I swear this oath that America will be. Is there anybody out there that will declare right here and right now that I'm going to do everything in my power to make America what it ought to be? Make America what it ought to be. Make America what it ought to be.
Reverend Barber, can you tell us what you're about to do?
Well, we're about now to do an act of moral fusion, civil disobedience. We've been 5 weeks straight. Right now, this is happening all over the East Coast. Next hour, it'll happen in the central area, then out west. Our focus today is on labor and poverty and living wages and guaranteed incomes. We believe we got to shift the narrative of this country, and the only way we can do it is people have got to put their lives and their bodies on the line. You have preachers and poor people and impacted people who are in these lines, and we're willing now to engage in an act of moral civil disobedience to drive home what is going on. We believe that injustice is happening in the halls of Congress and in the halls of state capitals around this country.
Where are you planning to be arrested in front of today?
Well, I can't say just yet, but I can say that we're headed toward the Capitol and toward the street, because what we're saying is we're going in the streets to say we have to stop because this country is going in the wrong direction. The bottom line is when we look at poverty today, 140 million people living in poverty and low wealth. We have more poverty today than we had in '68. We're spending more money in war today than we spent in '68 in the height of the Vietnam War. He was killed. The movement didn't end. It was assassinated. And that's why Dr. Liz Theo Harris, myself, and others have said we have to re-engage it, but not exactly the same way. They came to D.C. We're all over the country, and we're launching a movement, not ending a movement. And we're building coalitions of people of every race, creed, color, and sexuality who say we're going to build a multi-year campaign to change the narrative, to shift the voting in this country, voter mobilization, and to be a power from among the poor. So we're inspired by Dr. King and others, but what we also know is this is not a commemoration, because the last thing you do with a prophetic movement is commemorate it. What you have to do is reach down in the blood, pick it up, and re-engage it, and that's what this is.
The Reverend William Barber of the Poor People's Campaign speaking on Monday. He was joined in Washington by labor leaders, the Fight for 15 campaign, that's $15 an hour. After the rally, Reverend Barber led the protesters from the Capitol to the street in front of the Supreme Court, where about 100 of them were arrested. After their arrests, the Reverend Liz Theo Harris, the co-chair of the Poor People's Campaign, then led 8 other religious leaders up to the steps of the Supreme Court to protest the court's ruling upholding Ohio's controversial voter purge law.
We are the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival. So some moral witnesses are coming forward to bring our message to the Supreme Court. What do we want?
William H. Lamar IV, pastor of Metropolitan African Methodist Episcopal Church in Washington, D.C.
Shelley Gupta Barnes. I'm with the National Campaign.
I'm Noam Sonoy Spack. I'm with the Cairo Center and the Poor People's Campaign.
Minister Rob Stevens at Middle Collegiate Church in New York.
Reverend Graylin Hagler, pastor of Plymouth Congregational United Church of Christ, here in front of the Supreme Court, basically to really raise up the questions about the decisions that this body makes, and particularly the decisions that they make in terms of voter suppression, like in Ohio, and the decisions just the other day in terms of really sort of legalizing discrimination against LGBTQ community.
We're here in front of the Supreme Court. 9 people are being arrested. We're not talking about the Supreme Court justices of the United States, but 9 people of faith who are protesting the decisions of the Supreme Court, who are part of the Poor People's Campaign, led by Reverend Liz Theoharis, who, together with Reverend William Barber, is leading the Poor People's Campaign as they get arrested each week, along with hundreds of other people around the country. They're praying right now, and the police have told them that they will be arrested.
You're in violation of Title 40. If you do not leave, you will be arrested.
Hundreds of people are standing, lining the streets between the Supreme Court and the Capitol, where they just rallied, watching this arrest go down.
Everybody's got a right to dream, and before the champagne fails, we'll all go down to jail. Everybody's got a right to dream. Everybody's got a right to.
The scene in front of the Supreme Court on Monday, as Reverend Dr. Liz Theoharis, co-chair of the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival, Reverend Graylin Hagler, and 7 others, 9 people altogether, were arrested just in front of the court. About 100 people were arrested that day. They were taken from the Supreme Court to, well, we're joined by Reverend Dr. Liz Theoharis right now. She was released from jail last night, which means the 9 religious leaders were held more than 24 hours in jail. What happened to you in jail, Reverend Theoharis?
Well, thanks for having us and for sharing this story about people all across this country, standing up for justice and building this Poor People's Campaign. So we were indeed arrested in front of the Supreme Court and moved around quite a bit over the past 24 hours, but we were held at the Supreme Court for a while, and then moved into kind of city holding, and then
all this time you were handcuffed.
So we were handcuffed for the first 5 or 6 hours while we were being processed at the Supreme Court, and I think. We know that there's a kind of impoverished democracy in this country, and that poor people of all colors are criminalized, and we see the connections between that and why we need this campaign, and why people, including faith leaders from the Poor People's Campaign, were standing up for justice this past week. So we were kept for many hours. Handcuffed. We were, put into city jails with lots of poor people who suffer the indignities of life every day. We were kept at the courthouse for a while and then shifted to a federal court.
We had reports that your religious vestments were ripped off of you.
Well, so we had to remove them, and in fact, my stole that says Jesus was a poor man.
This is the sash you were wearing. Jesus is a poor man.
That's right, and it's a true statement from the Bible. It's also something that during the 1968 Poor People's Campaign, the caravans from Marks, Mississippi had that on there, and so we wear those in solidarity with the 68 campaign and with the Bible, so that was taken. And all of our, religious collars and vestments were removed. The Jewish prayer shawls that someone was wearing were removed, and folks got some of them back yesterday. I'm still waiting to get the stole back.
You were held overnight, cockroaches in your cells?
Yeah, just like lots of poor people experience all across this country every day. We were held, with cockroaches, with very little food, and
when you were brought before the judge, you were put in leg irons.
Well, so we were shackled actually in leg irons all day, which is the treatment that folks get poor people get across this country on a regular basis. And, I think it just ties into why we need a Poor People's Campaign, why we need to stand up and declare that we need the rights to living wages and to
Reverend Dr. Liz Theoharis, we have to leave it there. Co-chair of the Poor People's Campaign National Call for Moral Revival, a major rally in Washington on June 23rd. Special thanks to Sam Alcoff, Carla Wills, Chris Belcher, and our news director, Mike Burke. I'm Amy Goodman.